Ngai was very much something that evolved in my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and it moved with them as they traveled.
Hello and welcome to Holding Heritage. This is a space to explore and have honest conversations around the Asian North American experience. We'll focus on Canadian refugee stories, family, heritage, and bridging generational gaps. My name is Holly. Thank you so much for joining me. Hello and welcome back to another Building Heritage episode where we focus on topics through a more present lens, discussing and sharing how we are learning, building, and upholding our heritage today. In this episode, I'm sharing a conversation I had with two friends, Michael and Chon, about growing up speaking a somewhat obscure dialect of Chinese known as Ngai, perhaps more commonly categorized as a dialect or variation of the Hakka language. There isn't much out there on the internet about Ngai specifically. We'll get into a bit more of what we kind of know about it shortly, but because of this, I wanted to sit down with Michael and Chon, both of whom grew up in Ngai-speaking households after their families were refugees out of Vietnam during the 1970s. I wanted to chat about their experiences and thoughts around being second-generation children of this obscure dialect. In Michael's case, some of his family were refugees who fled to Sweden, and eventually his parents settled on Vancouver Island. Michael and I went to school together since we were young, and it's really cool to be able to discuss more about our cultural roots now that we're older. Chon, on the other hand, was born in England and raised in London, his parents having been refugees from North Vietnam as well. He is a cousin of one of my friends, Annie, who, if you listened to episode 11, have met already. The three of us dive into discussions about what we loosely know of as Ngai, and Chon and Michael share about what it was like for them growing up speaking Ngai at home. We discuss things like how the language has seemed to evolve and shift over time, interesting thoughts about why passing on this obscure dialect may feel challenging, and overall, we hope that sharing this conversation might be able to spark other conversations and community amongst our generation to share and connect. If you yourself are from a Ngai-speaking family or resonate with anything we chat about today, we would love to connect with you. So check out today's episode show notes at www.holdingheritage.com for some awesome links and information. I've included a list of resources and groups of some Ngai and Hakka communities that Chon and Michael have shared with me, so be sure to check them out. Without further ado, let me introduce both Michael and Chon.
Hi, I'm Chon. I'm based in London. I grew up in London, and I grew up speaking Ngai, but also Cantonese and obviously English.
Are you fluent in both Cantonese and Ngai?
We grew up speaking Ngai more, but then I lived with my grandma. My grandma didn't speak Ngai, so she only spoke Cantonese. But I was very against speaking Cantonese. I didn't like it. But basically everyone spoke Ngai. Both sides of my family spoke Ngai, and it's only the one person in my life that spoke Cantonese was grandma. So this is at the time before I could go out and explore and meet new people and understand that Cantonese is actually the more useful language.
Right.
I'm Michael too. I went to school with Holly and Chon's cousin Annie, and I grew up speaking Ngai with my mother and family. Most of my family. Most of my extended family speaks it. Growing up, I had a lot of family in Vancouver that spoke it, but they moved to Calgary, so they live in Calgary now and they speak Ngai there. But I got a lot of family in Sweden that speaks Ngai too. But yeah, my whole life I've just grown up speaking Ngai with my mother because she doesn't speak the greatest English. And I did learn Cantonese growing up, but it was mostly Ngai. Like, I'd say my Ngai is better than my Cantonese. When I speak Cantonese, it's so clunky because I toss in Ngai with it too. Yeah, it's pretty interesting growing up speaking this obscure language, which you don't even realize until you're a young adult how obscure it is, right? And that it's a dying language.
Before we move on, here is a quick rundown of what I was able to research in terms of information on the Ngai population specifically. Again, there isn't much out there, and I am by no means an expert. I'm just incredibly curious and hungry for more knowledge about this community because even my grandfather and older generations of my own family spoke Ngai. In order to get to the very granular group that is the Ngai people, there are two other important groups that provide more clarity on the way to understanding. First, the Hua people, who are those of Han Chinese ancestry who immigrated to Vietnam. As we know, the Hua people played an enormous role in private business in Vietnam, especially in Saigon during the 1970s. The second group that is important to know is the Hakka people. The Hakka people are a subgroup of the Han Chinese. The Hakka people get their name from the Cantonese words hak, which means guest, and ga, which means families. So the translation is literally guest families. The Hakka people are known for being nomadic, incredibly adaptable, and have a long, long history of many different migrations, making them the most diasporic among the Chinese community groups. The worldwide population of the Hakka people is estimated from 80 to 120 million worldwide. There are also an estimated 10 plus different dialects or variations of the Hakka language since there were so many migrations. For example, Hakka communities in Taiwan versus in Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Suriname all may vary in vocabulary and in local dialect. That is just a very brief look into the Hakka people. They have a very deep and rich history, so if you're interested in that, definitely take a closer look. I've included some great links in the show notes that you can check out. So after knowing a bit more about those two overarching groups is where we can begin to explore the Ngai population. From what I've researched, the Ngai population is sometimes referred to as the Hakka-speaking community in Vietnam and other nearby countries in Indochina, whose ancestors were of Han Chinese in southern China. The Vietnamese government separated Ngai from Cantonese when considering ethnic minority groups, and according to the Vietnamese government, many, if not all Ngai people had never considered themselves Hakka. Most of the known Ngai population in Vietnam were situated in the northern provinces nearing the southern border of China. There's also some vagueness out there claiming that because no one, including Chinese people, really knows how to categorize the Ngai people, they were simply categorized as Hakka. And since the two languages share many similarities and the ethnic ancestry of the two communities are in many ways alike, many younger generation Ngai people nowadays may categorize themselves closer to being Hakka or a sort of variation of Hakka. Ngai is a particularly interesting language to me personally because I grew up in a predominantly Cantonese household, but also grew up around other families like Michael's and Chon's and Annie's where I heard Ngai being spoken. To me, there are many similarities between Ngai and Cantonese to the point where I feel like I can sometimes understand it. Most families who speak Ngai also speak Cantonese, and there are many overlaps in terms of vocabulary and pronunciation. Both Michael and Chon grew up speaking both languages, but Ngai was the predominant one spoken within their immediate families.
There isn't a lot out there,
Not a
and
lot.
I've been researching a while, and every now and again something else pops up.
There's like a couple of YouTube vids out there of of people speaking it, but there's not much.
Yeah, so for me, my immediate family spoke it, my extended family spoke it. So when you heard it, it was almost a sense of security because it was only my family that spoke it and those close to you and really, really close family friends that spoke it. So the moment you heard it, you almost felt a sense of security. Okay, they're not strangers. I'm safe. So that's the sort of sensation I had. And then if you heard people speaking Cantonese, it's almost like, okay, they're a bit more arm's length. They're not quite as close. So there was a sense of security to it as well, in that it was such an obscure language. So when you did hear it, and not just hearing it, but if you hear it spoken in the same way, using the same phrases, the same accent, the same dialect, there's a familiarity to it.
It's definitely a familiarity. I grew up pretty, let's call it whitewash, right? I know Holly grew up the same way, feeling the same way. We grew up on the island.
Yeah.
So we wanted to be like the other kids, right? We wanted to be okay. We wanted to fit in. And growing up, I was just, I don't know, I was very naive, first of all. I was just happy-go-lucky kid. So I didn't even really know any of this stuff until like 16, not even like 20s. In my 20s, I'm like, this language I speak, it's dying. It's so obscure. It's like, you don't find it anywhere. It's like, I want to know more about it, right?
the language gets a bit jumbled. So the Ngai that we know, that we hear from North Vietnam, it has Hakka roots, but it's not as pure and it's not as clean as Hakka that you'd hear from someone, for instance, in Hong Kong or Singapore. If you were to go and find speakers who speak and find the closest match to what we know as Ngai, it would be, they'd call it Gong Sai Hakka. So across the border from Vietnam to areas like Dong Heng, Nam Ninh, so those areas, that's where you'd still find people speaking it. Less so now. Even when I was last there, you could speak Ngai and get by with just speaking Ngai, but people wouldn't speak it first. People would still be speaking Mandarin, and this is what, 2004, 2005 again. So everyone spoke it. Everyone spoke Ngai there, but it wasn't the first language that everyone greets people in.
So is Hakka and Ngai like very similar? Like if you guys hear someone speaking Hakka, can you understand what they're saying?
Most Ngai people, we don't call it Hakka, right?
Do you just call it Ngai?
It is a type of Hakka, I guess.
Yeah. It's like a dialect of.
Yeah.
The origins are, and typically we would refer to ourselves as Hakkanin.
I've always known it as Ngaiyin.
Yeah, but the roots are from Hakka. So Hakka speakers in Hong Kong, for instance, I'd hear them and I'd probably get most of it and understand most of what they're saying. But that is probably Hakka in its purest form. But there are some really obvious differences. It's like the sound we make when we say 3 and 4.
Yeah.
We say Sam, Shi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ni Sam, Shi. Based on my own research and what I know of Hakka speakers around the world, in Hong Kong, for instance, they don't have that sound. They have Sam, Si.
So there's a lot of overlapping of the three, Hakka, Ngai, and Cantonese.
There's so many dialects of Chinese, though, right? There's like more than 25, but they all overlap.
This probably comes back to the whole thing about people speaking what sort of became Ngai and Hakka speakers coming from all over the place. It almost came in and blended in North Vietnam as a sort of mixing pot, into a mixing pot. To the point where I have people in my own family, for instance, and we will have our different ways of saying things. For instance, I would say ni jomagai. So that is as pure as Hakka as you could get, jomagai, right?
What does that mean?
It means, what are you doing, right?
Oh my gosh. I was thinking that because I was like, yeah, it sounds like that. That's so interesting.
But then within my own family, I'd have some people that say, Jomanya.
Oh, yeah. I use both. I don't know.
So I would hear both and I wouldn't think anything of it.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow.
And it's not until recently that I thought about it. Ni Jomanya, ni Jomanya.
For context here, if you don't know Cantonese, in Cantonese, what are you doing is ne jo me. So you can hear the similarities in the phonetics of each of the languages.
I always reference our language back to Cantonese. Like, eat dinner, we say sit fan, whereas Cantonese is sik fan.
Yeah.
And Mandarin, it's chi fan.
Yeah.
It's always referenced back to Cantonese for me.
Yeah, I found since learning Mandarin, there's in some ways there are more parallels with Mandarin, and then
yeah. Holly and I took Mandarin school, but it did not stick.
Well, I imagine it's hard. It was probably at a time where you probably didn't embrace it, and you didn't hear enough of it.
No, we were naive children.
Yeah. It was like we just have to do it type thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But also, and I know this from having visited family in Canada before, there's a stigma about learning Mandarin back then as well, and mainlanders, and the term fobs, right? Where it wasn't cool. It wasn't cool to speak Mandarin. It wasn't cool to sort of be associated, we are British Chinese or we are Canadian Chinese. We're not like them, fresh off the boat. And so there was that stigma as well when we were younger. Obviously, you look back now and you think, how wrong was I? How bad was that? And you look back with regret almost. Yeah, but ultimately that's the environment and that's the way we were almost conditioned to view it.
Yeah, I think it was definitely like a conditioning sort of thing, especially like when you're younger, you can't comprehend.
Definitely. Yeah, you just want to fit in, right? You just want to be okay with yourself and not stand out.
Yeah.
And when you're living on Vancouver Island, where the majority of people are white, we just want to fit in. But even as a kid growing up, you don't even realize that, right? Everything's just subconscious until like you look back and like, I was just trying to fit in all these years and be okay with myself.
It feels confusing at the time, at least for me when I was growing up. It was sort of this like, I know I'm Chinese and I know that I shouldn't be embarrassed of it, but exactly what Chon was saying, like, oh, well, people think that I'm a fob or that I'm not westernized or I'm not cool just because I am a part of another culture. Whereas like now I think I don't know if it's just my outlook because I've grown up, but I hope that, you know, with more diversity in entertainment and society and media now, maybe it's considered more okay to be.
It definitely is more okay. I've always just thought of myself as Canadian for the most part. I've always wanted to just embody being Canadian. Maybe that's just growing up, wanting to be, you know.
Yeah. When you say Canadian though, like are you thinking like
Exactly. What does
westernized
that
Canadian?
mean,
Yeah,
right?
what does being Canadian mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I was growing up, yeah, totally. I would have viewed myself as British. I played sports, for instance, when I was younger, and in terms of which country, if I sort of made it and who would I represent, no doubt I'd be representing England, for instance. But the older I got, there's certain things you can't get past, like first impressions. I can't change this face. I can't hide this face. Well, I can hide half of it in the past year with COVID, but you can't really get away from how I look, right? So this will always be how I face the world. And no matter how Canadian you may feel, Michael, or no matter how British I feel, I'll walk the streets in London, for instance, and people will approach me. And until I open my mouth and speak, they won't know whether I speak English. And you can't get away from that.
It's a little different here in Vancouver since there's so many Asians here, right? So most people do kind of assume you speak English.
Yeah. But then that said, you walk around in Asia, you walk around in Hong Kong, and it's almost when
The opposite.
yeah, the first visits I had there, I had a sense of, okay, I don't stand out now. I don't stand out in that you can just walk the streets and almost feel and look like everyone else. So there was a sense of that. And that is a conflict, I guess. It's a conflict in identity. It's for me, I'll never be British. As British as my upbringing was, I feel I'm as British as I can be, but it's still not where your white English people are, or it's not quite the same. We are different, and I've probably accepted and acknowledged and found peace with that almost. If people approach me on the street and they don't know whether or not I speak English and they don't know what to expect, that's fine. You know, I'm not one to get annoyed at people because they make a judgment based on my appearance, because my appearance is my appearance and they're making a call based on their own experiences and their own education or lack of.
I'm so interested, Chon. You have 3 kids, right?
Yeah.
How do you feel in terms of raising, what would they be, 3rd generation?
So for me, the biggest thing for me is I don't want them to have the same cultural anxieties. I want them to be able to embrace their culture right away. I don't want them to have to wait until they're teenagers before they start discovering their own culture and start embracing it. I want to give them the environment where they can embrace it straight away and have the best of both worlds. So they can celebrate Christmas, they can celebrate their birthdays and have birthday parties as any other kid in school would.
Yeah.
And then also have New Year and the festivals and eat mooncakes and whatnot. And yeah, basically try and embrace it. The language thing is difficult for me.
It's very tough to teach Ngai.
Do you speak Ngai to your kids?
I speak Ngai to my kids.
That's
and until they go to school, so sort of the first 3 years of their life, they're fine. They speak Ngai. They understand it. And that's all they speak. The moment they hit school, they regress and then they forget it all. And they stop speaking it. And they just want to speak English. My son, for instance, he's 6 years old in Ngai, and once upon a time he would be fine talking back and forth, just normal grandchild and grandma type conversation.
Right.
Now he's like, Daddy, what's that in English? What's grandma saying in English? What's mama saying in English?
How does that make you feel when that happens?
That it doesn't really make me feel any sort of way, in all honesty, because I know it's because of his environment. He hears English more than he hears Ngai.
Right.
The reason why I picked up Ngai when I was younger was because my parents didn't speak English and they spoke Ngai to each other. And if you think of Annie as an example, for instance, Annie's parents speak Ngai to each other and teach them Cantonese.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a massive barrier in them learning Cantonese because they're not hearing enough Cantonese. You pick up the language that your parents or the adults around you speak to each other in. So if your parents are speaking in Ngai and trying to teach you Cantonese, which a lot of Ngai people do, like I have cousins who do that, and Annie is an example, and her family, they probably understand and pick up bits of Ngai, but we're never encouraged to speak it.
Yeah.
But we're encouraged to speak Cantonese. But then they're only hearing Cantonese on such a small scale. So that's where my kids are at the moment. So I speak Ngai at them.
And then do they speak English back to you?
They speak English back. My wife speaks English at them. Instead of Cantonese. They don't hear enough Cantonese, they don't hear enough Ngai to learn and converse in it.
Yeah. Like, unless you're
especially
actually practicing on a daily basis. Like, Michael, you had to speak Ngai to your mom because she didn't speak
Yeah,
English.
yeah, that's all we spoke together.
Yeah.
It's all just born out of necessity, my
yeah,
ability to speak Ngai. Because all my close friends, all their parents speak Ngai, but they don't speak Ngai. They can understand it, but they speak Cantonese.
yeah.
Same
How
situation,
how
right?
good is their Cantonese?
As good as mine, I guess. Some of them speak Mandarin. Some of them
Yeah,
speak better Cantonese, and they'll make fun of my Cantonese when I speak it because I toss in some random Ngai words and make it all clunky. Yeah, I wish there was more out there because last few years I've been just super curious about my origins, right?
Yeah.
I wish my father was around so I could ask him questions more about who he was and how he lived, and he spoke Ngai too, and he's not here, so I can't do that. But I could always ask my mother more.
Yeah, it's tough. I find myself often wondering, us as second generation kids, kind of being that bridging gap between this
It's tough.
generation that are essentially the last ones to know the language inside and out. If there's a way for us to keep that in a way that can be taught to future
I
generations,
found
but that's huge.
like learning to read and write Mandarin. It has helped in some ways,
Mm,
because yeah, I spoke Nai all my life, but everything's matter of fact. The conversations I have with my parents, they're very matter of fact
right.
conversations that you have within the household, right?
Yeah.
I'd never be able to explain in great detail my work, for instance,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
or even emotions and feelings and that sort of. Not that I'm desperate to have those conversations with my parents, but
It's tough.
would you be able to articulate that? It's never going to be the same as sort of living and breathing it as our parents did in Vietnam. My Ngai will never be as good as my mum and dad's, and it's proving so that my kids won't even acknowledge it. So
Yeah, I mean, we speak English every single day of our lives. It's really tough to speak to our parents with the same articulateness.
Yeah.
yeah,
And I feel like you need a lot of patience too.
Yeah,
When
and
trying
it's
to like
like
translate in your mind, I know what I want to say in English,
it's
but
just like
often,
right there. Can't
yeah,
put it out into words.
yeah. And oftentimes in Chinese, the words that you use and the phrases that you use, oftentimes not as descriptive or in depth.
yeah. The sentence structures and grammar and is so different
Hmm.
to English. Like you don't have plurals when you break down language for what it is and the structures and the patterns. That's why Chinese people find it so hard to learn English because the grammar is a whole new concept to them. The use of plurals is a whole new concept to them. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a massive challenge.
A topic that we came upon that I found incredibly interesting was the pattern we noticed in some Ngai speaking families, where even though Ngai is the more proficient and regularly spoken language between the parents, for example, they often chose to speak and teach their children in Cantonese instead. Some families even completely abandoned the native dialect and moved towards Cantonese for everything.
And culturally, there's a reason why people don't teach it to their kids as well. Because Cantonese is more useful. They want to teach their kids Cantonese. I get that. But then I've overheard people like my parents' generation, their friends, talking about how, oh, they don't speak Ngai. But they grew up speaking Ngai and they'll be like, oh, I don't speak it anymore. I've forgotten it all. And the gist of that conversation was they're ashamed of it and they want to distance themselves away from it. So there is an element, 100% is an element of that as well. So although some people speak it proudly, like my parents, there are others who spoke it growing up, but don't want to be associated with it. Don't want to be associated with the hillbilly Cantonese and the
Yeah,
Ngai, and
100%.
they want to change the way they speak. Some people go as far as changing their names, the way their family names are spelt,
Yeah.
just to totally disassociate themselves from it, which is a shame. I sensed a bit of that because my Cantonese didn't sound anything like people on Hong Kong TV, for instance, and Hong Kong people. So there's a little bit of resentment on that front as well. But yeah, now I totally embrace it. I joke about, I fool around with it as well, and
Yeah, it is really sad that, the shame can be a barrier to passing on the language. And you see that in a lot of other languages as well.
yeah. My granddad, for instance, when we speak Ngai and we say certain words, so
Mhm.
my granddad would have said Niu instead of no. Instead of saying Tendo, he would have said Ting Dao. So he would have been sort of that purer Hakka, but because everyone else sort of adjusted and changed the way they spoke Ngai, he would change it as well. Before he passed away, though, he unconsciously switched back and he would say certain things. So my whole life, I'd hear him say no, no, as beef. He'd lapse and say new. So this was towards the end of his life. So that's how consciously he's sort of correcting himself. He would have been consciously correcting himself all that time, and then it wasn't until the latter stages of his life where what sort of came natural to him. He was sort of reverting back to that purer sense of how he would have spoken. So it's crazy to think that he lived to 103.
Wow.
That's crazy.
To think for so much of his life, for decades, he would have been adjusting and changing the way he spoke, even to us. Towards the end of his life, he actually just subconsciously reverted back.
And why do you think specifically
I found
he
that quite
was
interesting.
changing the way that he was speaking to you guys specifically?
I think it's because that's how everyone spoke. So you go with the masses. So if in the whole village it's just our family that's saying Niu, it's only our family that's saying Ting Dao, Ting Dao, and saying things like Cantonese say Bo Fan, in Ngai would say Bo Fan, but you go back to how my granddad was, he'd say Bao Fan. But then when we say Bao in Ngai means something completely different. It doesn't mean Bo Fan. It means 好似包粽咁. Bao. So yeah, I hear Mum tell me stories about where people have conversations and they're saying bao instead of bowl, and people don't know what the hell they're talking about. How what do you mean you want me to wrap up the rice? No, just make the rice.
Yeah.
So you have Ngai was very much something that evolved. It was very much something that evolved in my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and it moved with them as they traveled.
I have a curious question that maybe you don't. I don't know if you would know the answer to, but I've never heard Annie's parents speak Ngai really to them, the kids. Do you know why that is? Like why they spoke Cantonese?
That's because they made that choice to speak and teach them Cantonese.
I've actually spoken to Annie's parents in Ngai.
Oh, really?
All the parents in Courtney, like they've always remarked that it was like interesting that I could speak Ngai and all the other kids couldn't, because it's just so rare.
I always had that as well. I always felt as though
I felt a little special.
Yeah, I'm speaking to my cousin's parents, for instance, in Ngai, and speaking more comfortably to their parents than they would.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like.
Wow.
Like Johnny, right? Johnny's grandmas and grandpa, I'd speak Ngai to them, and they'd be like, "Oh, Johnny, you should go learn Ngai."
But that's so interesting. So it's like you spoke Ngai to your mom because your mom spoke Ngai to you. But all of the other parents in the valley, they also spoke Ngai, but they just didn't teach their kids. They would speak Cantonese to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess they just wouldn't specifically try to teach their kids Ngai. They just probably speak Cantonese to them directly, right? Because that's probably more wide use and easier.
That's the thing that I found strange, and that's the point I was making earlier, was if you're speaking Ngai to each other, and then as parents, if you're speaking Ngai to each other and then you're trying to teach your kids another language entirely, there's going to be such a conflict because they're not going to pick up.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating. Like, I can't in my mind, well, obviously, I don't know what they're thinking, but yeah, where's the disconnect between why they would consciously choose to teach Cantonese?
Because Annie's parents are totally Ngai speakers. They speak Ngai.
Yeah.
They speak Ngai more comfortably than they speak any other language. So when I speak to Annie's parents, for instance,
I'll speak Ngai to them.
Yeah, we'll speak fully in Ngai. And it feels as though, for the most part, it does feel like you're articulating better with them and to them than they would their own children a lot of the time.
I think a lot of it is because the media our parents watched growing up was Cantonese media, right? The HKTV stuff, the Hong Kong dramas. So then it's more widely used and widely seen. So they probably speak that to their children instead, because there's really no use for Ngai, I guess. Probably in their minds.
And you get one shot at it, right? You get one shot at being parent.
Raising your kids.
You get one shot at it. And if you made that decision to teach them Cantonese and not teach them Ngai, how far down the line do you realize we're speaking Ngai to each other, but we're trying to teach them a wholly different language? Maybe we should speak Cantonese to each other instead.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
So I know of families that do that, where I know full well that they speak Ngai, they grew up speaking Ngai, but they speak Cantonese to each other now because they just want to do away with that and they're not passing it on to the next generation. So from their kids learning Cantonese point of view, they will adopt speaking Cantonese to each other.
To wrap up our episode today, Chon, Michael, and myself also chatted a bit about relating to one another in terms of having gone through some of the same feelings and experiences of frustration and resentment that so commonly come with growing up as second-generation children.
The resentment, it's not just the resentment towards the culture, because as a kid, that's your parent.
Yeah.
Your only experience of your culture is your parents. So your parents embody that culture and then they become the target for your resentment.
No, I definitely know about all the resentment growing up because I have a little bit of fire in me. So when talking to my mom and I get frustrated, I'll just get mad. Not lately because I've gotten a lot better about that stuff. But growing up, man, like the frustrations would just pile up just from, everything, right?
And with the language barrier too, like you trying
Language
to express
barrier.
yourself and not being able to find the right words.
It's taken a bit to get over that stuff, right? And you're still always working at it.
Yeah, I think definitely as you grow up and you embrace things a bit better, you look back and you understand and you try and almost make peace with what you've experienced. And
yeah, you realize your parents were just trying their best. That's what it is.
Yeah. But when you're young, it's hard to process when you're young. It's just kind of like,
When you're
why don't you get it? Why are you different? Why is this not easier?
Yes, being a naive kid it just comes with life though, right?
Enjoy it while you can.
Absolutely.
You do learn to appreciate them.
There we have it. Thank you so much for listening in to this conversation with Michael and Chon. I hope that you enjoyed it and that it perhaps encourages you to get more curious about your own language and open up some conversations. If you'd like to read more about Chon's experiences and thoughts around growing up in London and navigating his own family refugee stories and insights, definitely check out his blog at pingpongpeninc.blogspot.com, which is also linked in today's episode show notes at holdingheritage.com alongside a bunch of other great resources and links. Thanks again for listening, and I'll meet you back here again very, very soon. Bye! Music by Blue Wednesday. Be sure to check him out. He's amazing. And as always, Holding Heritage is created, produced, and geographically based on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh and Comox nations of the Coast Salish peoples.